Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrin from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Carlos Cagina is the technical producer, and Ryan White is the live stream producer, and we are streaming live on my YouTube channel, Strange Planet. Strange Planet. Tonight, and for the full 2 hours, we're going to be discussing something, well, truly evil. And it exists in our society. It goes on right under our very noses, something that has been ignored for too long and cannot be tolerated in a civilized society. Human trafficking. Human trafficking is a modern form of slavery. It's an extreme form of labor exploitation where women, men, and children are recruited or obtained and then forced to labor against their will through force, fraud, and coercion. Trafficking victims are often lured by false promises of decent jobs and better lives. The inequalities women face in status and opportunity worldwide make women particularly vulnerable to trafficking. And while some trafficking victims are forced to work in the sex trade, many others are forced to perform other types of labor, such as domestic servitude, factory work, or agricultural work. Trafficking victims commonly experience physical and psychological abuse, including beatings, sexual abuse, food and sleep deprivation, threats to themselves and their family members, and isolation from the outside world. And in case you're wondering, it goes on here in Canada too. We'll get some specific numbers shortly, I hope. The International Labour Organization estimates that at least 12.3 million people are victims of forced labor at any given time, 2.4 million of whom toil in forced labor as a result of trafficking. The U.S. Department of State estimates that 14,500 to 17,500 people are trafficked into the United States each year. However, these numbers don't include the many individuals trafficked within U.S. borders. I mentioned Canada. We've seen instances of trafficking for sexual exploitation and labor exploitation. We've seen both Canadian victims and foreign national victims. Shae Invidiata is an award-winning human rights activist, philanthropist, entrepreneur, speaker, and wellness advocate. And director of operations of the Invidiata Team, Shea has helped to develop the Invidiata brand into some of the most elite luxury markets and continues to grow the company with her father. Strongly believing in justice and giving back, Shea founded the not-for-profit organization Free Them, one of the nation's leading voices in the anti-human trafficking movement. She's known for her unwavering determination, leadership, and courageous spirit. She never hesitates to hold powerful people's feet to the regulatory fire, especially if it means protecting and improving the lives of others. Shae Invidiata, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And I know it's late for you, so I appreciate you hanging in there for 2 hours. But obviously, this is essential that we talk about it. Is there anything before we get rolling here and sort of dive deep into this topic? Anything that you'd like to add to my introduction in terms of human trafficking, just to sort of help set the table so people understand the scope and magnitude of this problem?
Yeah, sure. I think I always like explaining it more from a macro level and bringing it into a micro level. And when you look at globally today, there's over 40 million people that are in global slavery. And, if you don't have $40 million sitting in your bank account, that number for so many of us is hard to contextualize what that actually means. And the current population of Canada, just to put it into perspective, is about 37 million people. If you have people that are listening in even from the U.S., I'll say take the state of California, for instance, over 30 million people. And imagine for a moment that our entire nation of Canada is in some form of slavery. Every single person, you know, all the way from the East Coast, all the way to the West Coast, all of the territories. And 80% are women and children. And in Canada, the two most prevalent forms of human trafficking are forced labor and sexual exploitation. And, you know, you mentioned some other forms of human trafficking. And of course, you know, that exists. But when we look at in Canada, those are two most prevalent forms. Most people think that, you know, this is an issue that happens outside of our borders, or if they're victims in Canada, that they, you know, quote unquote, must have been brought in from places like Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, across the continent of Africa. And although that does happen in our country, over 87% of victims that are rescued in Canada are Canadian. And so this is a problem that we have right here at home. Globally, it's a $150 billion industry. And again, that number is very hard to contextualize. But today, this illegal enterprise that we're going to be diving in and talking about is greater than the profits of Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. And so you're talking about an illegal industry that has huge power, has huge force. And in my opinion, it is the greatest evil that exists on our planet today. There's many other stats that I could probably give, but I'll share them probably throughout our conversation. But I think for people, you know, it helps to really understand the scale of what is happening in our world. And like you mentioned, that so many people don't realize that it's actually happening, and it's happening right here at home.
The numbers are absolutely staggering. I think it ranks third after the illicit drug trade and the illegal arms trade, if I'm not mistaken. Is that accurate?
It is. It's the fastest growing crime on our planet today. And as you mentioned, it is the largest illegal enterprise next to arms and drugs. And it's the fastest growing because people who are involved in illegal trade have realized that it's actually more lucrative to be able to sell a body than it is arms and drugs. It's also a lot easier. It's harder to hide drugs. It's harder to hide arms when they're illegal than it is a human being. As long as you can control that human, and control their body language, you control what they say, what they don't say. You know, arguably a human is a lot easier to quote unquote make invisible. And the body can be reused over and over and over again. And the average time a body gets rented out is about 15 to 20 times a day. And so if I'm trafficking drugs or I'm trafficking arms and I want to sell you narcotics, you will have to come back to me every single time you want more of that product. And I'm going to have to produce more of that product in order to fill the demand. Whereas the body, you can just keep renting it out and getting more use out of it. And so in Canada, for example, one girl can make a trafficker about $250,000 to $300,000 a year, and so it's highly, highly lucrative. And you start doing the math times 10 girls, you know, times 20 girls, you're in a very, very cash lucrative illegal industry.
Help me understand, Shae. Help me understand how it happens. I don't know if there's a typical sort of scenario, but how does, let's say, a young girl in Canada, let's say she's living in North Bay, how does she fall victim? What happens to her? Walk me through that.
Well, there's many different scenarios that can take place. A very common situation can be, there's different, I'm going to say profiles, if you will, of victims. And the first thing to just kind of lay the foundation, I always say to people that wherever you have poverty and vulnerability, you're susceptible to human trafficking. You're susceptible to become a victim. And so anytime you look at a situation, and you mentioned North Bay, where there could be poverty, you're talking about small town, and vulnerability could be many things. Could be lack of education, could be lack of food, could be lack of shelter, could be broken family, could be abuse in the family. Anything that's going to contribute to a vulnerability. And when you're coming from even maybe a better home, those can be insecurities of a girl, of a young girl. So it doesn't actually necessarily need to be a vulnerability in terms of going hungry. And so a place like North Bay, you're lured with oftentimes with a boy or a young man who's going to be between the ages, usually between 18 to 22. And the important thing for people to know as well is that the average age of entry into forced prostitution in Canada and the United States is 13 years old. And so that means that there are too many and so many that are the ages 9, 10, 11, 12 in order to get that number to be as low as it is, to keep that average down to 13. And so, going back again to your scenario in North Bay, girl could be 12 years old, 13 years old, 14, 15, and is going to be approached by a male that's between the ages of 18 to even into their 30s. Oftentimes comes on as a boyfriend figure, and we call it the wooing factor. And that's where the girl is groomed. And sometimes there's an offer for a job in the city to make money, and that, this person will take care of them and provide transportation and make sure they're looked after. And we see this in places like North Bay, up in even the reserves. In Canada, the Aboriginal Indigenous communities are some of the most affected by human trafficking. And so there's oftentimes this, like I said, this promise that, you can make money in the city, and there's job opportunities, and, come with me and I'll give you a job. I'll give you work. And that work is not necessarily realized what it's going to be or how bad it will be, and fully what they're going to need to be doing. The other is the boyfriend approaching them. And, when you meet somebody and you go on maybe call it a first date, or you're getting to know them, what do? You ask them, where are they from? Do you have siblings? What do you like to do? What school do you go to? And freely, most of us give up that information. And so the beginning of that relationship is not under duress. There is no fear. And at the same time that male is telling this female how beautiful she is, how special she is, pours on all of the attention, makes her feel so special, feeling loved, really, taking her for coffees, buying her clothing. And at some point, that male, who this girl believes is her boyfriend, is going to ask her to do the unthinkable, and will usually put on some form of guilt that he's just spent all of this money on her, and this is what she needs to do for him to help him out, to make some money. It won't last long. It might just be one time, or that she needs to pay him back for everything that he's spent on her. And that switch will get turned, and this quote unquote loving boyfriend figure that this victim believes is her boyfriend is going to form into her pimp. It's going to form into her trafficker. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that grooming process, that luring and coerce process, you're offering up information. And so, one of the biggest questions that we always get asked is, well, why doesn't a girl just leave? Why doesn't she just walk away? And they get them into such vulnerable positions where they have so much information on these girls. And, sometimes there's families that are being threatened that if you don't do this, then we know where your brother lives. We know where your younger sister lives. We're going to tell your parents. And they've filmed them in very compromising, embarrassing, either positions or just with groups. And they threaten them with exposing them for what they're doing. And so there's a lot of fear that is used to control these girls. And later on, oftentimes very harsh drugs and alcohol is also introduced as a dependency to have to stay with these traffickers, and they form these drug addictions as well.
Shae Invidiata is the founder of the not-for-profit organization Free Them, and the website is freethem.ca. When these children are taken, are they not reported as missing, assuming that they have parents?
Yes, they, some of them are, some of them are not. And again, it's complicated because believe it or not, there are too many girls that are still living at home and are being pimped out at the same time. So a girl can be being exploited and trafficked and still coming home to the place that she calls home to put, a roof over her head. She might have parents in the house. And you could have parents that are working, 3 jobs to make ends meet. You could have parents that really don't pay any attention. If you come from a bad family, there could be addiction in the home as well. And they're not paying attention to really their children at all. You could have 2 parents that are just, full-time, corporate, super, super busy and not realizing that their child is being exploited. So there are many of those type of scenarios. The others, absolutely. There are children when they go missing, they are reported. In Canada, there's over 50,000 children that go missing every single year. In the United States, that number is 800,000. And I am 100% convinced that if they have not found the body, that child is alive and is being exploited across the country. I'm very convinced of that. I've been doing this work now for over 17 years, and it's crazy when you start connecting certain dots and what we see. So absolutely, yes, some of them do get reported, but there are too many that don't get reported as well.
I have read in the United States anyway, and I don't know what the situation is in Canada, but foster children can often be extreme or at extreme risk. Why foster children?
Well, again, there's a vulnerability there. They're already lacking in so many ways, right? Imagine being a foster child for whatever reason. Either your parents have died, there's sexual abuse, there's, abuse in general in the home. You've been removed from the place that was supposed to give you safe refuge. And so already, if you're in the system, you have a predisposition that you are vulnerable. And those vulnerabilities, traffickers will prey upon. There are many children in the foster care system that foster care, I refuse to call them parents because that's not what they are to some of these children, that actually pimp out the foster care children. There is a big issue with that in the United States. It does happen here in Canada as well. And the systems need to be doing better of vetting who they are placing these children in short-term and sometimes longer-term foster care.
We have about 2 minutes for the to the bottom of the or to the break, Shae. But let me ask you this, and if need be, we'll pick up on it after the break. And that is the recruiting, is the pimping going on in our schools?
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yes, it is. And I mean, we can, it's a longer conversation, but human trafficking is happening in all kinds of schools across Canada. You know, I speak to all different demographics. The youngest kids I've ever spoken to are grade 5s all the way up to university students. And every single time, with the exceptions of the grade 5s, I apologize, with the exceptions of the grade 5s that I've spoken to, but junior high, 7, 8, you know, I've spoken to every grade in high school. Every time I teach on human trafficking and what it is, I have at least one student come up to me afterwards to say, I didn't know what that was called, but this is happening to a friend of mine right now. And I've spoken at Christian schools. I've spoken at all boys schools, at all boys, more affluent schools. I've spoken at all different type of communities, and human trafficking is not, it doesn't know any boundaries. So
all right, we'll pick up on that when we come back. We'll take a quick time out. Shae Invidiata from Free Them, the website freethem.ca. More on human trafficking. Stay with us.
The owners of... Take a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Shae Invidiata stays with us from Free Them, the website freethem.ca. We're talking about human trafficking, a modern form of slavery that's happening right under our noses. In fact, although this may be very, very hard to believe, to wrap our heads around, it's happening in our schools. And so you said that you have talked to middle school children, and they know of someone, you've been told, that has been recruited, or that's not even the right word. That's such a clean, sanitized word, recruited. They have been coerced, obviously is the word, into prostitution. How does this happen in the school? So, I mean, are there fellow students that are pimping? Are there teachers, God forfend? Are there support staff? Who is responsible for coercing these children?
Yeah, it's it oftentimes will happen. Again, your average male that's going to be preying upon these victims is between 18 to in their 30s. So when you look at the high school demographic or junior highs, oftentimes the male that is luring the girls or coercing is coming from outside of those school systems. What is common within the school is having a girlfriend who convinces a girl to say, hey, I have a job opportunity, got some way that you could make some money if you're interested. And that's become a more common tactic that's happened, that we see more and more. And it's not that the girl is per se a pimp, like what we would call like a madam, which is a female pimp herself. Oftentimes it is that girl is already being exploited herself, and part of her job that she's being forced to do is to recruit and bring other girls. And in that sense of the word recruit, you chose to use a better choice of words. In this scenario, she is being forced to actually bring in other girls to her pimp, to her trafficker. And oftentimes the trade-off for the girl is that she won't be abused as much if she can, again, pay off her own debt, if she can replace it's somebody else to be coming in. And so you will see that very commonly the girl will recruit within the school. And so that's more common happening in the school. Otherwise, when it's the male that is approaching that female, again, mainly from a boyfriend figure, he's outside of that high school, given the ages, oftentimes between 18 to the 30 kind of range.
And I can only imagine that since the advent of the internet, that this has only exacerbated this problem. How much of the recruiting is now done online? The explosion, I would say, of the internet has been twofold. We have seen, obviously, a huge growth, yet at the same time, too, being that it's online, law enforcement over the years has gotten a lot better on how to track down and actually be able to do sting operations and rescue these girls because it's online. And a lot of the engagements start online. And so you will have COVID operations that take place. When you go to certain websites like Backpage.com, Craigslist, you will see many of these girls they're really sites that solicit for sex. And I prefer to call it what it is. So it's, these men predominantly that are paying to rape or paying to molest these children, the minors. In COVID, we've seen an increase big time due to, people being at home online. The Pornhub at the beginning of COVID had offered their members free for 30 days. And Pornhub is one of the biggest facilitators of online exploitation. So, during this time of COVID specifically, there has been an increase online, but also in desperation as well, where so many people are, worried about how they're going to provide food on the table. And for many children, as we know, going to school was their place of safety, was their place of refuge because the home was not safe. And so when you have now more agitated parents with their kids in the home, if they're already abusing them, stressing out about also finances and food, the child becomes an easy way for them to be able to make money by exploiting them. So we've seen all kinds of stuff taking place over this time. Girls that can't pay their rent and their landlords are saying, well, if you sleep with me and you have sex with me, then you can stay in your place. Otherwise, if not, then you need to leave. All kinds of exploitation that is taking place right now. You mentioned Backpage, and I mean that is a more sophisticated, organized type of organization, and it's gone. But I'm sure the CEO and others pled guilty to online sex trafficking. But I'm sure when Backpage went down, 100 more came up in its place. I guess what's troubling to me is, so for example, in the United States, human trafficking wasn't even illegal since before the year 2000. How is that possible? How could we not have had laws in place prior to 2000 that would make this illegal? And what is the situation in Canada? When did it go on the books, human trafficking?
So it's a tricky question for me to answer, because obviously we've had laws for a long time that says that slavery is illegal. And the difference here is that we've introduced a new word, calling it human trafficking. And because of that, new legislation and how and looking at the situation, how we've defined this exploitation now needs a new legislative structure. And so for the longest time, it really wasn't until about 2010 in Canada specifically that we really started to introduce at a federal level legislation that would not only prosecute traffickers, but would actually start to strengthen our laws on this issue of human trafficking.
That was the National Action Plan.
Yeah, that also came after the fact. The first bill that was introduced was Bill 268, which was a mandatory minimum sentence for traffickers caught trafficking minors. And Freedom, we were a stakeholder to that bill. And at the time, that was former MP Joyce Smith who put forward that bill. And shortly thereafter, she put together a document. At the time, it was called Connecting the Dots, and it was a national strategy on fighting human trafficking in Canada, because still at that time, this is 2010, 2011, Canada still didn't have a national strategy in place yet. When you go to third world countries like Thailand, whether they're enforcing it or not is a different conversation, but they still had legislation there. And it blew my mind that in Canada, a first world nation where we pride ourselves so much on being free, on freedom, that we did not have this type of legislation in place. And so, of course, we do now, but it's been a journey in Canada, an upward hill battle. And we've been very much behind on where I believe Canada should be, and even today.
Yes, I know. I remember in I guess it was around 2010, that Canada was admonished by the U.S. State Department for lagging behind. And here we think that we are so advanced and sophisticated and civilized in this country, and yet we are, or were, lagging behind, let's say the G20, if you will. The major Western industrialized powers. We're coming up on another break, Shae. When we come back, we'll continue to delve into this. I want to talk to you also about I remember producing talk radio in the 90s, and we would have people coming on advocating for legalization of prostitution, and they didn't like them being referred to as prostitutes. They wanted to call them sex workers, and I was never comfortable with that, and I refused to use that because to me that was an attempt to normalize the industry. And now we're seeing who is in fact being coerced into working as prostitutes. So I want to get your take on that as well, and what we can do regarding legislation to clamp down on this scourge, human trafficking. More of my conversation with Shae Invidiata from freedom.ca, the website. Back with more in a moment.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett from Zoomer Radio.
Shae, before the break, I was mentioning my experience producing talk radio in the 90s, and people would, at that time, there was this raging debate about, we need a red light district in Toronto, and we need to legalize prostitution, and we have to stop referring to them as prostitutes. They're sex workers, and I was never comfortable with that. Because I felt that was just an attempt to normalize what should not be a normal situation. Let me get your take on that. The term sex workers. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it really comes down to what you define as work, and there's two sides of the coin. That it's the oldest profession. Other people will say it's the oldest oppression, which is where my opinion lies. I believe that when you know your own value and worth, and you've been raised truly knowing that, you know, who you are and how valuable you are as a human being, the thought of selling your body to make money is just not a thought that you would subject yourself to. And I personally don't know any survivor who has come out of, quote unquote, the sex trade or from being exploited through human trafficking who was not sexually abused before they entered the trade. And the most important question for me, and always, is when, at what point, how old were you when you pulled what sex workers will call their first trick? And a trick is any type of sexual service that is being done to what they would call a client, somebody who's paying for sex or paying for a sexual service. And we started out our call earlier tonight, and I mentioned that the average age of entry into forced prostitution in Canada is 13 years old. And I will argue to my death that that is never a choice. And that is the makeup of who is in the trade. And so just because a girl might appear to be the age of consent or older, or she actually might be the age of consent or older, does not mean that she was of the age of consent when, to use sex workers the way they would phrase it, pulled their first trick. For me, it's, you know, how old were you when you were first exploited? And it's part of the biggest misconception, I believe, in the sex trade is that when we hear the word prostitute, we equate that word so much to choice. And it's a widely misrepresented term. And the more accurate term to be using is prostituted. And that removes choice from the situation. It removes choice from the circumstance. And so just because a girl is 19, 20, the most important question, like I said, is when did she first enter? And, you know, at 13, at 14, 15 years old, I will argue to my death that's never a choice. And you or some of your listeners might remember years ago, back in about 2013, there was the big case between Bedford, and it was first the province of Ontario.
Yes, that's what I was referring to. She was a regular guest on a talk radio show that I produced. Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, she struck down the prostitution laws, and it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. And myself, along with a handful of other very powerful women, strong women who are survivors of human trafficking, we were at Osgoode Hall that day that they were in court, and that decision was made to make a national press statement. And, you know, we were really upset, and we're saying that day to the media that what was not being spoken about in Bedford's case was that she's testifying in court as a 50-something-year-old woman. I think she was 54 maybe at the time. Don't quote me on that, but she was, you know, she was older at the time. And what was not being told is that she was just in her teens. She was about 13 years old when she was recruited by somebody more than double her age, who was abusing her, giving her drugs, and forcing her to basically be raped by men for money, handing over her profits to what she would call her boyfriend. That's not a boyfriend. And so we need to get very clear on our language. We need to get very clear on what the circumstance is and what's not. And Valerie Scott was another person that, you know, was alongside of Bedford, and she was 16 herself. And now, you know, she was in her, you know, late 40s or 50s, wanting to normalize and legalize prostitution. And that's a very different position when you're in your 40s and you've also been at this point doing this for so long. And the most important question is, when did those two women first enter? When were they first, when did they were forced to put their first trick? And it definitely was not over the age of consent. And, we had an opportunity in that year. The courts gave us 1 year to rewrite the prostitution laws. And Freedom was still is a federal stakeholder to Bill C-310, which was put forward by, at the time, the Attorney General of Canada, the Minister of Justice, Peter MacKay. And we put into legislation, it's still effective today, that looked at Canada and we said, if we recognize that the majority of victims of the girls that make up who's in this illegal sex trade, majority of them are not there by choice. Majority of them are, being trafficked and they're being exploited and sold. And so
Right.
why are we criminalizing them?
Shae, I've got to jump in here because this is a short segment. We have to take a quick time out. We'll come back and we'll talk about the current law regarding prostitution, where it is now illegal to purchase or advertise sexual services. It's illegal to live off of the avails of prostitution. It is legal to sell sexual services, although in some cases it's illegal to solicit in public areas. So we'll talk more about that. We'll also maybe talk about the Swedish model, whether we should be emulating that. Back with more of my conversation with Shae Invidiata as we continue to discuss human trafficking, modern day slavery. Don't go away.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show. Take a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Shae, before the break, I was, as I understand it anyway, sort of reciting the current legislation, which came around, I think, in 2014 regarding prostitution. That is, it's illegal to purchase or advertise it. It's illegal to live off the avails of prostitution. So pimping is illegal. It's illegal to advertise it, as I said, but it's illegal to sell, but you can't solicit in public areas. Is that do I have that right?
It's not illegal to sell sex. It's illegal to purchase it.
Right. I thought it's legal to sell, but it's illegal to solicit in public areas. Right.
Yes. Well, you can in public areas, but there are restrictions, like obviously like around like schools or within children, those type of precautions and protections are in place. But people ask, like, why did this law, which for some people, they don't think it makes sense because you're able to sell the service, it's illegal, but the service itself to purchase is illegal. And as we were starting to talk about, we looked at who was selling and why they're selling. And at the time in Canada, the only way for a police officer to remove a girl was to be able to detain her was by laying charges and to arrest her. And of course, when you get those charges also laid, you get a criminal record. And once you have a criminal record, that is a whole other horrible process for a victim, especially when they, are rescued and are on their journey of healing, that they now have a criminal record. And so we looked at that to say we need to remove that and put the police in a position of empowerment to be able to actually go into a situation, remove a girl who's willing to go and who wants help, and have the legal authority to be able to do that. And then, of course, at the same time, not criminalizing these girls who are being forced to be there and who are being exploited. And what we need to be doing is going after the demand, which is exactly what Bill C-310 aimed to do. And so the Johns, which are just, somebody who's purchasing sex, it is illegal to do that in Canada.
And what is the penalty currently under Canadian law for a John?
It really depends on the situation. So that's the more complicated thing for me to try to answer. Simply it goes down into silos. It goes down into the province, even down into the municipalities as to what they are allowed to do. There's certain regions where they will have to go to John school and they can have their sentence reduced. It's complicated.
In your mind, are the penalties sufficient? In your mind, are the penalties sufficient?
Correct. Yeah.
No, but I'm asking, in your mind, are the penalties sufficient in that area?
Oh, sorry. My apologies. No, I don't think, not just this one. I think in general, I still think that when you look at what happens to a victim, regardless of even length of time, the penalties that we have in our country and how our system is set up, where there's so many different credits and a sentence can be, 8 years, and then it can end up being reduced to only a couple of years. And then all of a sudden that person who's victimized you is quote unquote free and is going to be out. And yet that victim then lives in fear for not only their trafficker coming after them, but then the trauma that they also live with for the rest of their life. So no, across the board, I don't think that our penalties are severe enough to.
Right. You were talking about the trafficker, but what about for the John that purchases the services? What are the penalties?
It's both the same. I think that if you had harsher sentences, it would really demotivate somebody from being able to go out and purchase, a person. It would, we don't have a culture that is structured as such. And we're seeing this isn't even at like the street level, but we're seeing now more than ever in our world, right down from the street levels to gangs, to more organized crime, to different elite groups, politicians for many, many years, but more the depth of people in very high places that are purchasing, and what happens to them when they get caught. Not a lot. And that's not okay. And the system is not set up to discourage that and also hold those people accountable.
Well, we'll definitely get into the Epstein case in the second hour. So we just have a few minutes here before the top of the hour. I'll start this conversation, and if need be, we'll continue after the top of the hour. But so when a John is arrested, and what are the police instructed to do? Do they take the woman into temporary custody to try and counsel, or to provide some sort of a safe haven? Do they then try to identify who the pimp is and go after that individual?
Yes to both. They will, after coming into the station or with the police officer, if there's not already a social worker on site, or what we would call like a frontline worker that's equipped to deal specifically with human trafficking victims, they will be called to the scene, or they'll be called down to the station to meet the girl, or the officer will take her directly to a safe house. So it just depends on the scenario.
And how difficult is it often to get the woman, the victim in this situation, to testify or to give up her pimp? How often do they do that, or are they willing to do that?
Yeah. So, again, the system needs a lot of improvement. There's many factors as to why a girl would. It's not that she wouldn't be willing. There's really a lot more to do with being afraid.
Right.
Afraid for your own life, that just because your pimp might be actually put behind bars. As I mentioned, there's the fear that what happens when he gets out. But also, too, just because he's behind bars doesn't mean that he doesn't have other people that can come and find her. And so, there's extreme fear that if she talks, not just herself, but if she does have family and loved ones that are still around and alive that her trafficker knows of, that serious harm might come to those people. There's also the brainwashing that takes place from a female who at a young age, at the beginning, as we talked about at the very beginning of tonight, that the introduction to your relationship with the trafficker is not one of a trafficker. It's a boyfriend luring, grooming process that happens. And so the brainwashing that happens is that, you are still identifying with this pimp. Oftentimes the victims are identifying these men or the boys as their boyfriends. And it's a real thing, the trauma bond that forms. And sometimes these girls will not want to testify. And it's not until years later that when they've gone through a lot of trauma counseling and a healing journey that they'll look back and realize that person that they called their boyfriend was truly, in fact, exploiting them and pimping them out, that they were, trafficking them.
All right, we're going to take a time out here. We'll come back. Shae Invidiata stays with us for the second hour as well as we continue to discuss human trafficking, modern day slavery. The website is freethem.ca. We'll find out more about the organization and other forms of human trafficking as well. My name is Richard Serrett. Don't go away.
Live from Toronto, Canada, Earth, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
Thanks for inviting me into your home. Long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi. Your parents' well-appointed rec room with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker. Your loft. That greasy spoon just off the interstate in your cabin in the woods. Shae Invidiata is the founder of the nonprofit organization Free Them, and we're dedicating the entire program tonight to human trafficking, modern-day slavery. Now, before we get back to Shae, a quick programming note. Coming up in 2 weeks on the program. 2 weeks. Another vitally important issue, the robot and AI revolution. Dennis Combites is a robotics educator. He'll be here to talk about the almost unimaginable disruption that robotics and artificial intelligence is going to bring to the world economy and the workforce. Just here in North America, tens of millions of workers will be displaced within the decade. And we are, as you'll discover, woefully unprepared. So if your children are not taking some kind of coding or robotics course, you'll want to listen in. That's in 2 weeks. I'm leaving next week open because I'm working right now to get virologist Dr. Judy Mikovits on the program next week. That's, I'm working on it. That's TBA. But keep checking my website, strangeplanet.ca, strangeplanet.ca for programming information. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to my free monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum. That's another way to keep on top of what's happening on this radio program and also my podcast, Conspiracy Unlimited. Shae, let's take a few moments and talk about your organization, Free Them. So what specifically do you do in this field of human trafficking?
So Free Them, as you've mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization. We are 100% volunteer run, and we focus on preventative measures to fight human trafficking. And so for us, we focus on all things around legislative advocacy work, community events, different campaigns, online or in person, different speaking engagements. As mentioned earlier, I've spoken in many of the high schools, university groups, faith groups, corporate groups. And so, we really are on that focusing of the awareness component and the education side, which truly is, the prevention piece. And then we partner with different organizations that are taking in victims for aftercare services once victims are rescued. And we help to fund a handful of those operations across Canada.
So in terms of Canada's National Action Plan to combat human trafficking, if you had a wish list and you had the ear, and I'm sure you do, of the Prime Minister or the Minister of Justice, what would your wish list be in order to vastly improve the current strategy to combat human trafficking in Canada?
Well, to be very blunt, the Trudeau government has not been supportive on the issue of human trafficking. So I would first say to him that he should not try to dismantle the legislation that Freedom, many other agencies, and MPs have put in place over the past 10 years in our country. And I would ask the Prime Minister to consider his children in this issue and to not want to legalize prostitution. So, he has a very different position than Freedom does and the work that we do. And as a result of that as well, the national strategy is being, I'll call it being restructured at this point. And we do not know how what that outcome is going to be yet. So I would be saying to all representatives, because this is not a liberal, conservative, NDP issue, this is a human issue. And if you are a member of the legislative, of the House of Commons, it is your responsibility to uphold freedom, to uphold justice, to uphold human rights. And this is not a party issue, as I said. This is a human issue. And so I would want to see a effective national strategy that is actually being implemented, that gets strengthened year over year by having a lot more roundtables. Prior to the Trudeau government coming in, we used to have a consistent amount of federal roundtable discussions that would happen and take place across the country. And they have happened, but they're not as frequent. And like I mentioned, the national strategy right now, to put it in like civilian terms, is basically has been put on hold and is being restructured. And we do not know what that outcome is going to look like. And again, in a country like Canada, that should just never be the case. One of the other things that we've been working on for a good 8 years and is more at the provincial level is through the Minister of Education, and that the issue of human trafficking, it's paramount that it should be taught in schools. We've spent enough time already this evening discussing how human trafficking is happening in the schools. And the reality is that it's not being taught through curriculum, and it needs to be. Regardless of what your position was with Kathleen Wynne, who is the former premier for the province of Ontario, she restructured the sexual ed curriculum and introducing things like gender choice in grade 1. And when those type of conversations start happening at grade 1, I'm like, the human trafficking issue needs to be there as well, regardless of what your opinion is. But we can't omit such a serious topic that is happening to our young children in Canada, and freedom can't be everywhere. There's other organizations that do great work in Canada that are going into schools. They can't be everywhere. The teachers who see their kids day in and day out need to know the signs. No different than they are trained to detect child abuse. And they have a duty by law to report if they suspect that there is a child that is being abused in their classroom. And teachers also need to know those signs of a victim of human trafficking. And I say all the time, if your child has access to a phone or a tablet, your child could at any point be lured and start getting groomed to become a victim of human trafficking. It's happening through all of the apps, on Tinder, on Snapchat, on TikTok, on Facebook, on Instagram. And so it goes for circle that children need to be educated on this.
Right. I mean, I don't think this needs to be part of the sex ed course. This is not about sex. This is about personal security.
100%.
So yeah, it has nothing to do with sex. And the idea, as a quick aside, of teaching, children about gender choices in grade 1 to me is absolutely appalling. However, let me ask you about other forms of human trafficking, still within the realm of coercion and forcing young girls to do horrible things. And it's not just prostitution, right? There are dancers in strip clubs that have also been coerced into doing that. To what extent is that also something you're dealing with?
Well, that still falls under the same category. I don't know any victim who was just dancing and being forced to dance. It's kind of like a gateway, kind of similar to how, marijuana can be considered a gateway drug to other things.
Interesting.
Stripping is the same thing.
Okay.
So you might start there, but that's definitely not the only thing you're going to be doing. There's so much pay to rape that happens in strip clubs. And so it falls underneath the same banner.
Now, I know when the National Action Plan was being put together that I'm going to use this term loosely, the adult entertainment industry raised a hue and a cry, because one of the things that the National Action Plan tried to do, and I think this was passed into law, you'll correct me, was that they wanted to prevent foreign workers from coming in and working in strip clubs. And the industry, again in quotes, complained because they said that would create a labor shortage. What is the status there, and what are your thoughts on the restriction of foreign workers in strip clubs?
Again, so Toronto specifically, we have what's called like a non-rezone, which means however many strip clubs there are now, which I've not looked it up as of late, but a few years back, there was only about 10 or 13 of them. And that means that is the most that we will ever be able to have, because we have a non-rezone. So if a strip club gets burnt down, if the owners decide to shut it down or go bankrupt, or for whatever reason it closes, it will never be able to reopen again. And so the argument of having this shortage really doesn't make sense when you look at the scale of those establishments specifically. And again, we look at, people who are coming in who don't know the rights that maybe somebody like yourself or me would know in growing up in a first world country, and talking about fair wages and the amount of hours that we are by law, being able to protect ourselves of how much we can work in a day. when you start following those who is getting these visas and where they end up, there's exploitation at the end of so many of them. And so, that was a real concern. But then, like I said, when you're looking at who was saying that there's going to be this great shortage, it's those establishments weren't able to grow and multiply, if you will. So the argument just really didn't hold up for me, in my opinion.
No, and I hope I wasn't making it sound like I was trying to justify that argument. I guess what I was trying to find out in my awkward roundabout way was, so are they hiring young women who are being coerced? And if that can be demonstrated, why are these clubs not being shut down?
Oh, yeah, I mean, again, like they'll say that they came in on, those visas, and the amount of investigation that would need to take place. The police are majorly underfunded. You would have to have these regular, I guess, like checkups, to be able to find out if they are actually only dancing and not being exploited. But it's just inevitable. You sign up for dancing and you're coming in on a visa like that. It doesn't take long. It doesn't remain that way.
Is freedom also involved in the type of human trafficking that involves other industries like agriculture or domestic, let's call it domestic servitude?
Indirectly, yes. We were a part of the OPAPA case that happened, that was still the largest human trafficking case to go before a Canadian court. And that was predominantly all men for forced labor out in the Hamilton, Stony Creek kind of Niagara region. But we specifically, with what we deal with and the victims that Freedom helps to fund, like the aftercare process for, is sexual exploitation.
All right.
Yeah.
So I guess where I want to go next is, we've been talking about, individuals who coerce and exploit. We did touch on Backspace, Backpage, which is a little more sophisticated, obviously. But to what extent is this problem perhaps far more organized and orchestrated and aided and abetted in the highest levels of power than we might be aware of? Rather than focusing on the individual pimps, of course, who are just complete human excrement. But I get the sense that this is a much more organized problem, and that they may be aided and abetted from people in very high places.
Yeah, I mean, Epstein is definitely not the first. He's absolutely not the last. You look at Weinstein, before the Epstein case really became more mainstream, if you will, as it did. You look at Peter Nygard, who is really going to be one of the next, I would say, Weinsteins or Epsteins to be exposed. So when you look at those three people alone who have extreme wealth, and the people who they are connected to and the friends that they are connected to, you should start to question. Everybody knew what Epstein was doing. We didn't know, you and me didn't know to the extent of it, but you have senators that have come on national television to state that they all knew what he was up to and what he was doing, and many of them partook in it. And we're seeing the flight logs and now with the records that are, all of the papers from Maxwell that are being, that were subpoenaed by court order to be released, I think heading into the next month or so, we are going to see some major arrests of people that a lot of people, I think, have respect for right now, very powerful people, even as far to say that people that we admire or have for long periods of time. And so, these are the type of what we would call rings, where, as you're saying, they are highly sophisticated, and they're at a very different level than the street level gangs.
Right. So, for example, we mentioned Epstein, and we can come back to that. But the other example is the BBC presenter Jimmy Savile, who was an absolute monster, destroyed I don't know how many lives, and was allowed to operate. Again, many people knew he seemed to be protected, even perhaps by the network where he worked, by certain individuals. We see this play out again and again in the United States, for example, NBC and CBS, and they knew things and the stories were killed. Savile even perhaps protected by members of parliament. Is that going on? And I know this is maybe speculative, and we don't obviously need to name names or organizations, but do you sense that there is that level of protection in Canada at the highest levels, in Parliament, at television networks?
Yes, I do. I think that the corruption, that it's very strong, it's very deep. Yes, I do. U.S. and Canada.
Right.
It begs the question why somebody is able to still be free. It begs the question as to who else is involved and what type of blackmail do they have on that person. To have charges literally dropped and disappeared, or having stories buried, or having the media so controlled, as hopefully people know this by now. I still find there's a lot of people that are not awake, that we are programmed to only see what they want us to see. You've got 5 companies that run and own over 90% of the media in the United States. That's definitely not democracy. We are being told what to believe. And so when you have people like this in positions of power where, you barely hear about it in the media, and it gets buried, or it gets quickly debunked and it gets dismissed, you have to raise an eyebrow to saying, like, who's allowing that to happen? Who's capable of having that happen? I'll just even bring up one example more recently that we can all relate to, is what's been dubbed as the Wayfair scandal. I'm not going to say one way or the other if the Wayfair selling children or missing people on their site is legitimate, if it's happening. But the reality is it basically was a trending topic for like 2 days. And then all of a sudden, like, it was completely radio silent.
I want to pick up on Wayfair when we come back. Excuse the interruption, Shae. We are heading into a break, but that's a good example. It may be a case where the actual story was wrong, but the narrative is right. If it wasn't Wayfair, it's someplace else. And not to suggest that the people who work at Wayfair were involved, but sometimes these companies are used by third parties. And again, apparently the story was debunked. That may be why it was dropped, but again, it may not be Wayfair. But you mentioned, companies like Craigslist are used by third parties. Right. So again, the story might be wrong, but the narrative is right. So that doesn't mean we should just drop it. We need to delve further. But there doesn't seem to be an ounce of intellectual curiosity in the mainstream media these days, and that's most distressing. All right, back with more of my conversation with Shae Invidiata, human trafficking. More to come.
Don't be afraid of the dark. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To talk to Richard, call 416-360-0740 or toll free 1-866-740-4740.
When I talk about spiritual warfare on this program, this is what I'm talking about. Yes, we are dealing with flesh and bone here. We are talking about the exploitation of people. But what could possibly motivate someone to engage in this kind of activity? What could possibly motivate someone to turn a blind eye or to cover it up or to run cover for someone or to simply dismiss it, as in the Wayfair case, the furniture manufacturer? And if you're not familiar with the story, often these are, I'm going to call them citizen journalists who first bring our attention to these things, and then the media, the mainstream media, says, "Oh, that's silly. That didn't happen." It's like the Pizzagate story. Perhaps this particular restaurant was not involved in a child sex ring, and so now every time something like this comes up, the mainstream media says, "Oh, that's another Pizzagate." No, it's going on. We may not have the right address, but it's happening. And so what possesses or what is causing this to me is spiritual warfare. This is evil exists. This is evil. Shae Invidiata is with us. Free them. So the Wayfair case, some citizen journalists noticed that, I think it was on Reddit, that Wayfair was advertising certain products at exorbitant prices. So let's say it was an area rug that might cost normally $150. It was being advertised for $15,000. And some of these products were being given names, and they included screenshots from Wayfair. Some of these products were given names that coincidentally were the names of recently missing children. That's the story in a nutshell. So then the question was, is Wayfair involved in child sex trafficking? Well, I mean, the idea here is that you're not going to pay Wayfair $15,000 and they're not going to send you a child in a box. If you've ever ordered from Wayfair, these are sort of flat stacked. You have to assemble them like IKEA. They're not smuggling children in boxes. But it is possible that Wayfair is dealing with third parties, and these third parties are using Wayfair as cover. So you pay Wayfair for $15,000. They send you the carpet, but then there is this side deal that's going on, this horrible, hellacious transaction that's taking place where you actually do receive services from an underage child. That's my understanding of that Wayfair situation. Do I have that more or less correct, Shae?
You do. I thought it was a really good explanation.
Okay, so again, I believe it. I've read that it was debunked. I don't know to what extent that it's been thoroughly debunked, but again, the mainstream media is very quick to dismiss these things. And again,
they are, and I think that in and of itself begs the question, because without a formal and thorough investigation, how can you, in 48 hours, conclude that there is no illegal activity happening? So for me, the point is not even about Wayfair. It's how quickly and why so quickly the media said, "Oh no, well that's not happening. It's quote unquote too far-fetched," or that's just ridiculous. And it's not ridiculous, because people and children and women are sold online on multiple websites and platforms every single day. And the fact that the media debunked it so quickly has me personally more inclined to do more digging on Wayfair. that for me alone does not make me feel good. The response, even from Wayfair, all of their communications have been pretty weak, in my opinion, in terms of what their response was. So, you know, when you look at the kind of, when you were asking me about the original question of this is a prime example of how deep the corruption runs up the chain. And for our conversation today, you know, I just want to be clear that my position with Wayfair is not to say that they are in fact selling children. I think that it's probable, but there has not been a thorough investigation. But what was shown and the information that came to surface leads me to want to look further into it, because there's a lot of red flags. You know, but the point, and the bigger point, is who's shutting it down and why are they doing that? And what do they have to gain from that? And so when we look at the power structure and where that's coming from, for me, it always begs the question that they have to be involved somehow. They have to be contributing to what we call this problem of exploitation of children specifically, because they do not want this to come out. They do not want this to be exposed. They do not want people like yourself and your audience listening tonight to become awake to the issue of human trafficking, but at the highest levels. It's one thing to keep it kind of, you know, no pun intended, on the street level. But once you start moving up into these higher positions, you really start rattling the chain. And this is what we're seeing happening right now, right? Like across social platforms, you have the world and so many civilians that are waking up and are calling out the exploiters. And we just did a recent campaign that was on exactly that, about exposing the exploiters. This is the time that it needs to happen. And so, yeah, the corruption is all the way up. And I believe that's why things like this get very quickly debunked and dismissed and buried.
I've interviewed, I've lost count of the number of people who allegedly, I have to use that term,
Sure.
claim that they were victims of mind control. And people like Kathy O'Brien, for those familiar with the Transformation of America, who claim that in addition to being mind controlled, and that mind control, this goes back to the Nazis. MK Ultra has its roots in Nazi Germany, who their evil scientists discovered that you could control someone's mind by fracturing their psyche, and that could be done. It could be induced by massive trauma, often involving sexual trauma. And so there are so many of these cases out there, and I'm not saying that they're all legit. Some sound very credible to me, as I've interviewed countless of them. But this idea, and they say again and again, that there is at the highest levels an organized child sex ring where they are used and abused by world leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Does that ring true to you?
It does. I mean, I feel like we almost need a full other hour to just talk about that. But yes, it does. I do believe that it's happening amongst world leaders and people in position of power, that many people would like to just throw the word conspiracy at it. I think conspiracy makes it more comfortable for a lot of people to sleep at night. And I think that it also gives you permission to essentially look the other way. And it's uncomfortable when you realize that the people who are running the world, so to speak, that are partaking in abusing children and exploiting them, it's sickening. It really, really is sickening. But I am a strong believer in exactly what you asked me. I do believe that is happening.
What you're saying is that's a very powerful statement that you're making, because you are someone who has a great deal of credibility, obviously. You have a seat at the table. You are a stakeholder. You are a consultant in these sorts of things. So for you to say that is very powerful. And let me just mention, conspiracy, the name of this program. I gave this show that name because I'm here to take that word back. It's a legal term. And often it is used, obviously, in the pejorative to stifle discourse. But lest we forget, there are tens of thousands of criminal conspiracy charges laid in North America every year. It is a legal term. And what we are talking about, the coercion, abduction, exploitation, murder, in some cases, of the most vulnerable in our society, that doesn't happen without criminal conspiracy.
Right. Yeah.
Before I forget, is there a human trafficking hotline in this country? I know that in the United States, I was reading, it's funded and they receive something like 150 calls a day, which may not sound like a lot, but imagine, the courage it would require for someone who's a victim to actually call that number. So what if there is a number, please give that out.
There is, and at any point in time, if you go to our Freedom website, it is on the bottom of every single page on our website. But if you know somebody who is possibly in a position who needs help, or you need help yourself, they can call our Canadian human trafficking hotline. It's nationwide, and of course it's all confidential, and it's also multilingual as well, and it operates 24/7, 365 days a year. And that number is 1-833-900-1010.
1-833-900-1010, and we'll be repeating that throughout the rest of the hour. Shae, stay put. We'll take a quick time out and come back and talk further about human trafficking. Back with more in a moment.
Don't be afraid of the dark. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio. To talk to Richard, call 416-360-0740 or toll free 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. Some of you are familiar with the movie The Manchurian Candidate. It was based on a novel by Richard Condon that was first published in 1959, and of course was turned into a movie starring Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury and so forth, about this prominent U.S. political family whose the son is brainwashed into being an unwitting assassin for a communist conspiracy. The point I bring that up is Richard Condon, a very famous quote. He said that if imagine your worst nightmare as a scenario, and he said it's probably true, and I think that's the case with human trafficking. And when I say our worst nightmare, the idea that people that we respect, admire, even beloved individuals are likely involved, and that may be revealed very soon. Do you get that sense, Shae, that we're on the cusp, particularly with Ghislaine Maxwell languishing in a holding cell in Brooklyn, if she's allowed to live and testify, that this could finally be blown wide open?
Yes, and I do believe we will see at least a certain amount that's going to come out from her if they keep her alive. I won't be surprised if she shows up in the headlines as suicide, which in my opinion is a code word for being murdered. We've seen that many times. I do not believe that Epstein took his own life. And for people listening, you can go down your own rabbit hole of that and look up people who were on the brink of exposing people in high places for either sex trafficking, pedophilia, child exploitation, and things even much worse, and on the brink of that. And then all of a sudden, they committed suicide. So for me, that those dots don't work. They don't add up.
I think you're suggesting Chris Cornell, maybe one of the names out there, that a musician who was perhaps suicided because this was something that he was apparently looking into.
Yeah, Chris Cornell is a good one. Isaac Cappy is another fantastic testimony. There's extensive videos on his knowing he knew he was being hunted, if you will, that his days were numbered. Those would be two great spots, two people to go look at.
It's also rumored that Anthony Bourdain, Kitchen Confidential, was also involved, as was his girlfriend.
Yeah, Anthony Bourdain, Avicii, Justin Bieber is another very interesting one as well. Even though, of course, we know he's alive, but he's got very interesting testimony for his experiences. There's a lot. There's a lot of them. And I think over the next month, and hopefully sooner, there's really going to be kind of that airing out of dirty laundry, if you will. And I think a lot of people are going to be very, very shocked. It's going to be hard to digest, personally.
Yes.
But it's very, very deep. It's very evil. And they are going to do everything they can to keep this information sealed and to not come out. So, which is why I'm surprised Maxwell is still alive right now.
So if you see something, say something. 1-833-900-1010, 1-833-900-1010, the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. It's nationwide. It's confidential, of course. It's multilingual. It operates 24/7, 365 days a year to connect victims and survivors of forced prostitution and forced labor with social services and or law enforcement in communities across Canada. I know it's volunteer, but there are costs associated with this. How do people contribute to free them?
They can contribute just through our website. We have a PayPal that you can give through. You can also do an e-transfer that's just give@freedom.ca. You can do it the old-fashioned way and write a check as well. We still accept those. So those are the three main avenues.
All right. We are going to take a quick time out and come back and take some calls. And let me give those numbers out as well. 416-360-0740 in the Greater Toronto area. 416-360-0740 and toll free from just about anywhere. And the signal of this program reaches from Maine to Minnesota, south to the Carolinas, 1-866-740-4740. Toll free, 1-866-740-4740. Back with more. Stay with us.
When in doubt, blame the government. You're listening. When you look at the sky, ever wonder if someone's looking back? This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To speak with Richard live, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Let's go right to the phones. Kevin is in North Bay. Good evening, Kevin. Welcome.
Hello there, Richard. And hello, Shae. Good evening to you.
Hello.
I wanted to ask about what resources are there for boy victims of sex trafficking. I know from my research that 36% of children who are sold into sex trafficking are boys. Yet, when I look for resources, at least here in Ontario, for male victims of sexual assault or male victims of child sex trafficking, there's little to none for exclusively for boys. Being almost having become a victim myself when I was a teenager, I finally found at least one resource that I could call, and that was only recently. So what is there out there for boys that are victims of this?
It's a fantastic question. And I think you also raised a very good point that there are a lot more males that are victims than most people would realize. And more, there are resources that are becoming available, but they are still, I agree, they're still very scarce. In Toronto, through like the Toronto website with 311 underneath their human trafficking, there is some information. I would say that going to Covenant House Toronto on their site is probably one of the best resources, not only for information, but even to actually call in to be able to talk to somebody. If youth or, males are needing support, they would be one of my first go-to.
All right. Thank you for that, Kevin. The idea that young boys are also being coerced into this, or it would suggest, because I'm guessing, almost all of the perpetrators are male, would suggest that there is a pedophilia aspect to this. And I find it disturbing that lately we are seeing, even with some mainstream news outlets, an attempt to normalize pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been tracking that as well, Shae?
Oh yeah. And I think it's interesting. I think that we kind of say lately, but it really has been there for quite a few years without many of us realizing it. CNN has done, I would say a lot of harm in that, in where they are really questioning whether they're trying to normalize, like you said, around pedophiles, hiding behind the gay movement and adopting the same slogan that love is love, and that that this is an orientation. And at no point ever is a child able to consent to an adult, ever. It doesn't matter if it's gender on gender, a boy, girl, it does not matter. A child, period, full stop, is never able to consent. And that is not love on love. That is rape. It's molesting. It's abuse. And the media has, even if people go to my Instagram, my personal one, which is just Shae Invidiata, I have a highlight that I put there that it's called Pedo. And I did a whole video on this week about Instagram and also Facebook really not protecting our children. And it's interesting that in this time where they are censoring anybody that speaks out against COVID or the narrative around vaccines, anything that people are speaking out against, that these accounts are getting shut down left, right, and center. Yet when you report a very obvious, not an ambiguous, a very obvious account that is a pedophile, that is there to lure and groom children, if you report that account, Instagram has come back numerous times, and they're on my highlight, you can go and see it, that they won't remove the account because it does not violate their community standards, which so many people over this past week, especially after I posted this, were reporting them and sending me the photos that they got the same response. So, again, you have to question why. Why are these platforms, why is the media trying to normalize something that is so horrific that should just not be a conversation starter? We should not even have to have the conversation around if a child should be able to be raped and molested or taken advantage of by an adult. Period.
Well, welcome
why
to
are we having that conversation?
Welcome to postmodernism and moral ambiguity.
Right.
That's where we're at. I want to go to the YouTube live chat for a question here. You Betcha, a regular listener, thank you, You Betcha, for all your support. He asks, is it wise to have a fully legalized sex industry so that it's a lot more easy to distinguish who is in it voluntarily and who is being trafficked. Interesting point. What do you think, Shae?
So I'm going to say, in theory, and not just with the issue of prostitution, anytime that the government comes out with a theory on how to do something, it looks good on paper. Once it gets executed out, it never turns out the way that they say it is going to be. So when you look at the issue of prostitution, I encourage people to go look at other countries where they took that approach, that they thought that if they were to legalize it, they'd be able to regulate it. They'd be able to, quote unquote, protect the girls. They would have these structures in place to do exactly like this person that just asked this question. And when you look at a place like Amsterdam, they have already successfully shut down 1/3 of their red light districts because in the theory was not necessarily a bad one, although I don't agree with it. But when it got played out, it did not work. What they saw was an increase in organized crime. They saw the average age of girls dropping who are entering into the trade. And again, they saw other girls being brought in from other countries who are being exploited. The moment, like, when you have people who are willing right now to be in illegal crime, when you legalize that, they don't just become honest businessmen overnight, right? Like, that doesn't just happen because you legalize something. So it just forces now this industry to go even deeper. And it just does not work. And so I look at countries, and cities like Amsterdam's a good one. Australia is another one where you will see an influx and an increase of human trafficking, organized crime that takes place from that legalization.
I want to give out the number one more time for human trafficking. And again, if you see something, say something. And this is a 24-hour multilingual service. If you are a victim, pick up the phone call. They will put you in touch with the right people to get you out of your situation. 1-833-900-1010. 1-833-900-1010. And the website freethem.ca. Shae, a great honor speaking with you. I hope we can do this again. I know it's keeping you up late. You've got a busy week, I'm sure, but I'd love to have you back on again.
Thank you. I would love to keep the conversation going as well, so I'm happy to come back anytime.
All right. Shae Invidiata, founder of the non-profit organization Free Them, and dealing with this scourge, human trafficking, modern-day slavery happening right under our nose. And what do we do about it? We turn a blind eye, by and large. All right. Back next week, working on Dr. Judy Mikovits. The mainstream media would call her a controversial virologist. Well, when they say ignore this person's been discredited, that makes me want to speak to that person all the more. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And again, in 2 weeks, we'll be discussing robotics and artificial intelligence. And this is an important issue. It's just not theoretical. The robot revolution is here. They're talking something like 80 million workers in North America. 80 million workers will be displaced, replaced by a robot. And this is, if you think this won't affect you, think again. Even fashion designers, for example, will need to know about robotics. So get your children into coding and robotics. And one of the top robotics educators, Dennis Combites, will be here to talk about that in 2 weeks. All right, my thanks to Ryan White for live stream producing, Carlos Cagina for technical production. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.